we undertook an Australia-wide study of academic flying practices. And that included a survey of all academics across the country and also of university policy. And we did some hands-on research as well on alternatives to flying. But rather than speaking to that larger body of research today, we're just going to pull out some findings from the flying research that's relevant to our present moment, and also thinking about how RMIT might not just embrace but lead a paradigm shift around lower carbon online academic networking and collaboration practices. Now, in the short time we have, we can't say much. This is a huge terrain, but we see this as starting or at least contributing to a conversation that many people are now having around the institution about how RMIT might drive change in Australia and globally in this space, using research to inform its decisions. So the initial context for us wanting to understand and document Australian academic flying practices was firstly, of course, our involvement in SUP and its drive to make RMIT a more sustainable campus. And we should note that flying has been somewhat of a blind spot for universities when it comes to driving institutional sustainability. So the larger background to the research was this growing concern about the huge carbon emissions associated with flying. At the same time, we were seeing a strong and growing push within the academic sector towards mobility and internationalisation. So kind of seemingly paradoxical trends there. So I'm going to hand over to Andrew now, and he's going to speak a bit more in detail about the specific empirical research we did before I kind of round off the discussion.
Great, thanks, Tania. Can everyone hear me? Ooh, apologies. Can everyone hear me?
Can you put your volume up a wee bit, Andrew?
Let me do that. Is that better?
Yeah, we can hear
yes,
you. It's all good.
Okay.
Thank
Great.
you.
No worries. Okay, so as Tania mentioned, I'm just going to discuss some of our findings. So I'm just going to have to go back a slide here. Yeah, so we can see that in the pre-COVID era that COVID was a big part of Australian academic life. Australian academics took on average 3 domestic return flights a year and 1.7 international flights a year for work-related purposes. And so you can see in the graph there that the blue bars represent domestic flights and the red bars are international flights. And as you can see, there is a significant minority who don't fly, who take just 1 flight a year, but for the large majority of academics, flying is or has been a kind of a habitual part of academic life. And if we ask people if they ever fly for work, only 1% didn't undertake any work-related air travel. And also a noteworthy group here is those academics that took 8 or more return domestic flights in the past year. And a much smaller group of people who took 8 or more international flights a year. And this kind of class of academic, these high flyers, as we call them, is also associated with academic seniority and success, as you'd sort of expect. So around 2/3 of the academics in that group held associate professor or professor positions at their institutions. Okay. So what do academics travel for? This is really a key question for us. Not surprisingly, the main reason that we found is conference attendance, with over 90% of academics flying to conferences in the last 12 months. And then with meetings and other academics coming in second, at over 50%, and nearly 40% said they had travelled to do fieldwork for data collection, and 25% for meeting with industry partners. So what's really important here is that many of these meeting practices are continuing to occur during COVID, albeit virtually, pointing to the fact that there's nothing really necessarily essential about mobility or air travel itself for having meetings and conferences. Fieldwork may be another issue though. But the key point here is that while flying may have been habituated in a pre-COVID era, it isn't necessarily essential, as we're sort of finding out. Okay, next slide. Oops. And you can see here that the sort of powerful assumption that surrounds air travel for Australian academics, where it's generally thought of as a necessary part of academic life rather than sort of a luxury or an indulgence. So you can see here, well over half of us see air travel as being necessary, extremely necessary, and another third of us see it as somewhat necessary. So very few of us sort of regard air travel as being not really necessary for your academic career. So you can see here some of the key reasons why academics see air travel is important to sort of drive this home: the collaborations, the networking, and the exposure, particularly internationally. So face-to-face connections are seen as sort of the key here, as being the gold standard for how we should perform this network building and building of professional relationships. So this need for air travel is clearly about the practices and opportunities that air travel is seen to enable, rather than just traveling for traveling's sake. But as we've seen during COVID, it's still possible to do our jobs quite well without travelling. And in the case of DIRC, the centre that Tania and I work at, we've probably found more connections and collaborations have been occurring during this time with other centres and global researchers and industry leaders during this period, because everyone is in the same boat. No one can fly anywhere. Oops, sorry, I'm just gonna manage two screens here. Yeah. So we also looked at non-flying alternatives and sort of attempts to perform mobility are also sort of really important. We looked at this in our research, and we sort of tried to look at how we might start imagining a different set of ecology of practices, we call it, that may not be completely excluding of air travel, but involve a sort of a richer and more careful set of practices that take into account, for instance, carbon emissions and issues of equity and so on. So pre-COVID, the most successful academic is one that will be hypermobile, able to attend international conferences and meetings on a regular basis, promote the university on a global market for students, and cultivate networks that can tap international sources of funding. But that obviously has implications for who can succeed within the academic community, as not everyone can fly regularly or at all. And it does seem to create an obstacle for career progression for those who can't or choose not to fly. So in terms of breaking down barriers of access, be that financial barriers for academics that can't afford to fly to conferences, particularly in the global south, disability barriers for those who find it difficult to fly, barriers to do with caring responsibilities for those academics that have young kids or otherwise can't travel away from home, or for the increasing number of people who are seeing the environmental and ethical barriers of flying because of the carbon footprints and the impacts on climate change. Okay. Oops. So non-flying alternatives have involved various attempts to sort of develop technological solutions of quote unquote being there or having a sense of physical co-presence that as I mentioned, was quite important for academic networking. So the conference, the CHI conference, the Computer Human Interactions Conference, you can see in the top right there, there was an option to attend the conference remotely using a telepresence robot, which you sort of are able to move around and see and hear what the robot sees, and also giving you a sort of a roboticized form of physical presence at the conference itself. So we did a little project there also using one of these telepresence robots to sort of attend conferences. And I even attended Tania's maternity leave party via the telepresence robot. And then you can see another one on the left there, which is called the Chameleon Mask. Again, this is sort of a device designed to sort of allow you to hear and see what someone else is seeing, and potentially negating the need to fly somewhere just to sort of be at a conference or a meeting. And there's obviously a lot of work being done on sort of more very immersive virtual reality, mixed reality conferences. And you can see that in the bottom right. We also had a bit of fun experimenting with international partners and virtual forms of conviviality and collaboration. So this is in 2017. We were having a live conference dinner with our Lancaster colleagues who were having breakfast at the time because of the time difference. And we sort of tried to imagine one of the conference, which is obviously one of the most embodied and materially dependent practices in academia. And the meal in particular, we were sort of focusing on that as sort of and try to reimagine it as an online virtual experience. And it's been interesting to see academics actually do this in lockdown, sort of using eating and drinking as an occasion to socialise with colleagues virtually through practices like Zoom drinks. Might have been invited to some of those, as a way to sort of maintain these social and professional connections in the absence of physical co-presence. Another part of the work that we did on digital conferencing was looking at these new ways of doing conferencing, these new sort of meeting and collaborating practices, but doing it without air travel. So over the past few years, there have been these virtual conferences that have started to pop up. This one was in 2016. It was called the Nearly Carbon Neutral Conference, I guess nearly because everything emits carbon, even computers. But yeah, this one was essentially held in May 2016 over a few weeks. Presentations were sort of posted online, and people were interacting with them in that way. It was said to have apparently 1% of a standard conference's carbon footprint, and apparently generated 10 times the amount of discussion and traditional question and answer sessions do. So you might not totally buy these estimations or these comparisons, but they do raise questions about how we sort of value physical co-presence over and above digital engagement. And this is another one, sorry, yes, this is another, which was a conference called the Around the World Conference. Again, a very similar format where parts of the conference were sort of streamed online and live, should I say, and then other parts were sort of pre-recorded. So again, more of these virtual online conferences are popping up even pre-COVID, and they're certainly coming to the fore now. And with that, I'll hand over to Tania.
Thanks, Andrew. So another kind of experiment, I guess, in global online conferencing that we've been involved in is the EPIC conference. So I'm co-chairing that this year at, or I guess through RMIT, and Andrew's also involved as a production coordinator on that conference. So EPIC is an organisation for ethnographers who work in tech companies, and it was started by Intel, Microsoft 13 years back. And we had planned to have a physical conference in Melbourne at RMIT in October. So instead of postponing or cancelling that when the pandemic hit, we decided to run it as a completely online event on Pathable, which is a proprietary virtual event platform. Now, many online conferences claim to be global, but in reality, I think a lot of us find that involves they're often events broadcast from the global north, and audiences, particularly those in Australia, have to get up at 2 o'clock in the morning to attend talks, or they have to pre-record their presentations, and they don't get to have a kind of live involvement in those kinds of conferences. So early on with EPIC, we decided to go truly global, though I don't think we quite realised at the time how much work that would involve. And I'm happy to talk a bit more about that in question time. So firstly, that involved rethinking global geography, just a minor task, and creating a new connected world called Pangea, where the key organisational principles are around 3 time zones. And we've named those Parkes, Geelong and Wodonga, had a bit of fun there. And there's something very pleasurable about hearing North Americans refer to themselves as members of the Parkes time zone, and people from London through to Mumbai identifying themselves as coming from Wodonga. So far, we've got participants from around the world, from 26 countries, from 6 continents, so that globality is really there. And the conference is actually going to be running 24 hours over 3 days. So that's a huge event. The other, I guess, part of that EPIC experiment has been to kind of rethink parts of the traditional conference genre rather than just to replicate, what we used to do in a physical conference. So we really saw this as an opportunity to think about new ways of doing things. And one of the things that I've been working on is something I've termed a deconstructed keynote. So Bruce Pascoe, who everyone will know is an historian and Indigenous agriculture specialist, was originally going to travel to Melbourne to be a keynote. But instead I travelled with a filmmaker to Bruce's farm north of Mallacoota, and we filmed him speaking about the bushfires, Indigenous land management practice, caring for country, while he walked around his farm and the surrounding forest. So that's just one example of an opportunity, I guess, that was thrown up by our online conference that, ended up being very collaborative and very connected in a way that I guess a traditional sage on the stage keynote doesn't tend to offer. Okay, so really briefly summing up, as we've suggested, academic air travel was something that had become quite habituated in academe, and a habit that we really haven't had much of a chance to interrogate and reflect on, I think, until now. And as Andrew was referring to, it's been a very costly habit for us, not just in terms of institutional and personal financial expense, but also, of course, environmentally and in terms of potential impact on family life, and for high flyers in particular on their health and well-being. Secondly, when we talk about it being a costly habit, we're understanding that less in terms of individual choices for academics, but more as a kind of institutionally framed habitus, to use sociologist Pierre Bourdieu's term. So that's a kind of structured agency, I guess. So in our survey, for instance, academics often express concern and guilt, on the one hand, about the environmental impact of their own travel, but at the same time, they felt air travel was built into the very fabric of institutional and professional academic life. So where to go to from here? I think first up, we need to recognise that we actually have a major opportunity ahead of us. The COVID pandemic for universities, governments and corporations has created something of a democratisation of organisational experiences, at least for the global professional managerial classes that we belong to, and we recognise there's significant socio-economic and geographic divides around COVID. Because conferences and international meetups have been largely postponed or cancelled, online has become the main game in town, and to some extent we're seeing virtual meetings and events starting to become normalised and habituated, in part due to the sheer length of time that we're all spending in socially distanced contexts. So we've got a unique opportunity here to break old habits and build new ones that are premised on a more equitable and lower carbon future. This is not just a matter of talking about change, though. This is really something that we need to enact change through that kind of academic habitus that we were talking about. So I think there's a bundle of practices and approaches that we need to weave together here. This includes institutionally promoting and importantly funding alternatives to flying. It also means starting to reshape academic culture and assumptions around air travel so that flying becomes seen as the exception rather than the norm. And linked to this, I think, is the need to rethink what best academic practice and success looks like, to promote and spotlight academics who model low carbon practices in their academic collaborations. Finally, I think there is a time sensitivity to this. We need to act now as early adopters rather than riding it out and waiting for the new normal. We know from our research that Australian university policies lack a strategy to decrease the normalisation of air travel in the broader university sector. RMIT is unfortunately not an exception to that rule. Our annual sustainability report for 2019 only mentions air travel once, and that's on page 65, despite its being a very significant contributor to RMIT's overall emissions. So the take-home message is that COVID has given RMIT, as a university of technology, a chance to be a leader in Australian academia around low-carbon global connectivity, coming up with new policies in a post-COVID world, joining with industry and government as across the sector organisations are thinking about the new normal that doesn't involve as much air travel and physical co-presence. So we'll just end on a slide, if you can switch to that, Andrew.
Is that there now?
That shows, have you got that last slide there? It's a little bit slow sometimes, isn't it, through Teams.
It should be there.
so thanks very much for listening, and here's the website for the Work Ecologies project. So there's the Work Life Ecologies project. There's a number of different studies in there, but publications, etc., from our flying research if you want to look more into that. And there's also a couple of projects there that we're now moving forward with that come out of that project. So one is funded by ACAN, and that's on e-change and remote work in Australia. Obviously, an area that's really kind of timely and important now. And the other project is looking at, it's using a digital ethnography to look at current work practices in the home during COVID, and we're just about to wrap up that project actually as we speak. Okay, thanks very much for listening.